Picture this: you're holding a cloak from the Middle Ages. Its fabric worn but still vibrant with intricate embroidery. At first glance, it's just a beautiful garment, but look closer and you'll discover something extraordinary. Hidden in the stitches are letters, symbols, even entire messages woven into the design. This wasn't just decoration, it was a secret language, a way for medieval seamstresses to preserve stories that ink and parchment could never capture. These women were more than artisans, they were silent historians, stitching history into the very clothes people wore every day. Think about the power of that. In a time when many women couldn't read or write, they found another way to make their voices heard. They encoded resistance into hems, whispered prayers into embroidery, and documented lives in threads that outlasted generations. A cloak wasn't just warmth, it could be a record of a family's lineage, a protest against oppression, or a love letter folded into the fabric itself. These seamstresses turned needle and thread into tools of storytelling, and their work is a testament to the creativity and resilience of women whose names history often forgot. So how did they do it? What secrets are still waiting to be unraveled in these textiles? Over the centuries, many of these messages were overlooked, dismissed as mere decoration, but today we're piecing together their hidden meanings. This video is a journey into that lost art, where every stitch tells a story. Together, we'll explore how these women used their craft to defy silence, how their designs carried coded messages across borders, and why fabric might just be one of history's most overlooked archives. By the end, you'll never look at a piece of clothing the same way again, because woven into those threads are echoes of lives, loves, and struggles that deserve to be remembered. Let's begin. The tradition of weaving stories into fabric stretches back further than you might think, long before the Middle Ages, even before the written word became widespread. In ancient civilizations, textiles were more than just practical items. They were living records. The Bayeux Tapestry, for example, isn't just an embroidery. It's a 70-meter-long chronicle of the Norman conquest, stitched with scenes of battles and betrayals. But while grand tapestries like this were commissioned by kings and bishops, everyday women were quietly stitching their own histories into the linens and garments of ordinary life. What makes these textile narratives so remarkable is how they bypassed the limitations of literacy. In societies where women were often denied formal education, needlework became their alphabet. A simple floral pattern might contain the initials of a loved one, or a series of knots could mark significant dates, a birth, a marriage, a loss. In some cases, these designs even held covert messages. During times of political unrest, symbols hidden in embroidery could signal alliances or warnings, allowing women to communicate under the radar of those in power. Take the case of medieval English seamstresses who stitched white roses into their work, a subtle nod to the Yorkist cause during the Wars of the Roses. Or consider the quilts made by enslaved women in America, where certain patterns were rumored to contain coded directions for the Underground Railroad. These weren't just decorative choices, they were acts of quiet rebellion, a way to preserve identity and resistance in threads rather than ink. What's fascinating is how universal this practice was. From Norse women weaving runes into their wool to Chinese embroiderers hiding poems in silk, cultures across the world shared this unspoken understanding that cloth could carry memory. Even today, when we examine these textiles, we're not just looking at craftsmanship, we're deciphering diaries written in thread. Every stitch is a decision, every color a choice, and together they form a language that outlasts the spoken word. The real genius of these seamstresses lies in how they turned something dismissed as women's work into a powerful historical record. While official chronicles were written by the victors, these textiles tell the stories of the overlooked, the mothers, the widows, the daughters whose voices were excluded from the history books. Their needles were their pens, and their fabrics became the pages where they inscribed their truth. To understand the true impact of medieval seamstresses, we have to step into their world, a society where women's roles were tightly constrained, yet their needles gave them a voice no one could silence. In an era when official records were penned by monks and clerks, often overlooking the lives of ordinary people, these women transformed everyday objects into living documents. A bridal gown might carry the names of ancestors in its lacework. A funeral shroud could weave together a lifetime of joys and sorrows in its motifs. Even something as simple as a child's bonnet might hold protective charms stitched into the lining, a mother's hopes made tangible. What's striking is how their work blurred the line between art and archive. While scribes wrote in Latin, a language few could understand, seamstresses spoke in symbols that crossed barriers of class and literacy. A sheaf of wheat embroidered on an apron wasn't just decoration, it was a prayer for abundance. A series of interlocking rings might celebrate a village wedding, while a hidden bird in the design could symbolize a loved one who'd passed away. These weren't random choices, they were a visual language as deliberate as any manuscript. Consider the tapestries that hung in great halls. To the nobility, they were displays of wealth, but to the women who made them, they were often something more. The famous unicorn tapestries, for instance, are filled with botanical details so precise that historians believe they contain herbal remedies or coded references to local folklore. Even in spaces controlled by men castles, cathedrals, courts, women's stories were literally woven into the walls, and let's not forget the communal aspect of this craft. Needlework was rarely solitary. In sewing circles and at hearthsides, women exchanged patterns like scribes copying texts, preserving and adapting designs across generations. A stitch taught by a grandmother in France might reappear decades later in a German convent, carrying with it fragments of family memory. In this way, seamstresses didn't just record history, they created networks of shared knowledge that stretched across borders and centuries. Perhaps most powerfully, their work challenges our modern assumptions about what counts as historical evidence. We're used to valuing parchment and ink, but thread often tells a fuller story. Faded ink can't reveal the calluses on a scribe's hands, but a quilt shows every pull of the needle, every moment where the stitcher paused or hurried. The slight unevenness in a line of embroidery might mark the day a woman learned her son had gone to war. These textures, these imperfections, are where the real history lies. So the next time you see an antique piece of fabric, look beyond its beauty. Those threads hold whispers from a world where women turned constraint into creativity, where the humblest materials became vehicles for memory. In a society that often dismissed their voices, they found a way to speak across time. And now, centuries later, we're finally learning to listen. The language of thread was as nuanced as any written text, with every color, knot, and stitch carrying layers of intention. Take something as simple as a red thread. It could flutter through a sleeve's lining as a secret declaration of love, or blaze across a bodice as an act of quiet defiance. In a world where women's words were often restricted, these choices spoke volumes. A deep crimson might honor a martyr, while a brighter shade could celebrate a wedding, the same hue carrying entirely different meanings depending on its context and craftsmanship. Floral patterns were especially rich with symbolism. A rose wasn't just a rose, its petals could trace a family's lineage, with thorns subtly hinting at hardships endured. Ivy stitched into a hem might symbolize enduring marriage, while a single forget-me, not hidden in the folds of a shawl, could memorialize a lost child. These weren't arbitrary decorations, they were a visual genealogy, a way to stitch identity into fabric when official records excluded women's stories. Even the direction of the stitches held meaning. A vine curling upward could represent aspirations, while one trailing downward might signify mourning. Geometric designs often served more practical purposes. In some communities, zigzag patterns were believed to ward off evil, but during times of persecution, they took on another role. Historians have uncovered garments where these seemingly abstract lines actually mapped safe paths through forests or marked the locations of sympathetic households. A quilt's repeating diamonds might look like simple ornamentation until you realize they align with constellations used for navigation by those fleeing oppression. Religious symbolism, too, was woven into the mundane. A tiny cross concealed in a cloak's embroidery could be both an expression of faith and a subtle act of resistance in regions where such symbols were banned. Stars might reference biblical stories, but they also served as celestial guides for travelers. And then there were the knots, deliberately tied to encode prayers, with each twist representing a whispered plea for protection or justice. What's extraordinary is how these symbols transcended borders. A lily stitched by a French seamstress might carry the same meaning as one embroidered in Poland, a shared visual language that connected women across cultures. Even when wars divided nations, needlework maintained these silent threads of understanding. A mother fleeing conflict could wrap her child in a cloak stitched with familiar motifs, turning fabric into both a comfort and a compass. The true brilliance of these coded textiles lies in their duality to the untrained eye. They were merely beautiful, but to those who knew how to read them, they were maps, diaries, and manifestos. A single garment could celebrate joy and commemorate loss, declare loyalty and conceal dissent, all without speaking a word. These seamstresses weren't just making art, they were crafting a covert communication network, one that depended not on ink or parchment, but on the quiet, relentless work of their hands. Imagine running your fingers along an embroidered border, feeling the raised threads of what appears to be a simple floral design until sunlight hits it just right, revealing tiny letters hidden in the twists of each petal. This was the genius of medieval seamstresses. They transformed ordinary stitches into a secret script. The herringbone stitch, for example, wasn't just a way to reinforce fabric. Its zigzag pattern could spell out initials when viewed at the right angle. Chain stitches might loop around to form dates or locations, while delicate satin stitches concealed entire phrases in their shimmering surfaces. To the untrained eye, it was mere ornamentation, but to those in the know, it was a cipher waiting to be cracked. One of the most fascinating examples comes from a 15th century altar cloth discovered in a German convent. At first glance, it depicts saints and biblical scenes, but researchers noticed something peculiar. The halos weren't just gilded threads. Upon closer inspection, the stitches forming the golden rings spelled out the names of the women who'd embroidered them, a defiant act in a time when such work usually went unsigned. Elsewhere, a noblewoman's sleeve from Tudor England bore an elaborate vine pattern, but nestled in the curves were the words "Remember me" in Latin, stitched so finely they'd vanish in candlelight. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate acts of subterfuge, a way to etch identity into fabric when society demanded anonymity. The real mastery lay in how these codes were tailored to their audiences. A peasant's smock might encode harvest dates or family lore in simple running stitches, while a queen's gown could hide political alliances in the complexity of blackwork embroidery. In some cases, the very materials carried meaning. Threads dyed with rare pigments might signal wealth, while a single strand of blue, painstakingly imported, could denote piety or connection to distant lands. Even the direction of the stitching held significance. A row of knots angled leftward might indicate danger, while those veering right could promise safety. What's remarkable is how this language evolved under pressure. During the Reformation, when certain symbols became dangerous, seamstresses adapted. Crosses morphed into abstract shapes, prayers were disguised as decorative motifs, and once explicit messages fractured into fragments scattered across garments. A cloak's lining might contain only half a phrase, while its matching gloves held the rest, ensuring only the wearer knew the full meaning. This wasn't just craftsmanship, it was a survival tactic, a way to preserve forbidden beliefs in plain sight. Today, historians use techniques like raking light and magnification to uncover these hidden texts, but even now, we've likely decoded only a fraction. Every rediscovered piece holds the potential to rewrite small corners of history, revealing the quiet rebellions and intimate bonds that official records ignored. These stitches are more than threads, they're whispers from the past, waiting for someone to listen. The Bayeux tapestry stretches nearly 70 meters long, a vivid retelling of the Norman conquest embroidered in wool on linen. Most see it as a straightforward celebration of William the Conqueror's victory, but look closer, and the stitches tell a more complicated story. In one scene, King Harold is depicted twice in quick succession, first swearing an oath to William, then seated triumphantly on England's throne. Conventional interpretations call this a simple narrative sequence, but some historians spot something deliberate in the awkward spacing. The way Harold's figure seems to stutter across the fabric. Could this be a seamstress's quiet rebellion, using her needle to introduce doubt about Harold's supposed betrayal? Then there's the mysterious figure of Elfgiva, a woman shown in a doorway, her face framed by an unnamed clergyman's gesture. For centuries, scholars debated her identity, but the real intrigue lies in why she's there at all. The tapestry's main scenes focus on battles and political maneuvers, so why include this enigmatic woman? Some suggest the embroiderers wove her in as a nod to the untold stories of women affected by the conquest, a fleeting acknowledgement that history isn't just made by those who wield swords. Even the borders teem with subversion. Amidst scenes of war, the lower edge bursts with farming scenes, animals, and laborers' ordinary life persisting despite the upheaval. These details don't advance the official narrative, they complicate it, reminding viewers that conquest isn't just about kings, but about the people who fed them, clothed them, and buried them. What's most striking is how these deviations mirror techniques found in humbler textiles. Just as a peasant's smock might encode protest in its stitches, the Bayeux tapestry's mistakes could be carefully placed dissent. The Normans commissioned the work to legitimize their rule, but the women who threaded it may have left their own marks. A dropped stitch here, an odd perspective there, tiny acts of resistance in plain sight. After all, who would suspect a seamstress of altering history? And then there's the matter of material. The tapestry's linen is English, not Norman, and the dyes trace back to local plants. Even the stitching style, a blend of Anglo-Saxon and continental techniques, hints at collaboration between conquered and conqueror. The cloth itself becomes a metaphor, two cultures forcibly woven together, yet the threads never quite align. Centuries later, we're still picking at those seams, discovering how much slips through the gaps of official history. Among the most daring examples of textile codes were the fugitive cloaks of 16th century Huguenots, garments that didn't just tell stories but saved lives. Picture a family fleeing under cover of darkness, their heavy wool cloaks indistinguishable from those of any other traveler. But hidden in the lining, tiny stitches traced the contours of mountain passes, marked safe houses with discreet crosses, or even spelled out the names of sympathetic contacts in towns along their escape route. These weren't just clothes, they were wearable maps stitched in threads that wouldn't bleed if soaked by rain or betray their wearers if searched at checkpoints. The women who crafted these cloaks turned embroidery into an act of defiance, using techniques passed down through generations: herringbone stitches for rivers, French knots for meeting points. They encoded entire escape networks into seemingly plain fabric. One surviving example from Lyon features a floral border that, when unpicked, reveals a list of Protestant families awaiting transport to England. Another, found hidden in a loft in Provence, contained a child's smock with the Lord's Prayer stitched in mirror writing, legible only when held up to a window. The precision was breathtaking. A single misplaced stitch could mean capture, yet these seamstresses worked with the calm urgency of those who knew their needles held the weight of lives. What's often overlooked is how these textiles adapted to shifting dangers. Early Huguenot cloaks used obvious religious symbols: a dove for the Holy Spirit, a vine for communion. But as persecution intensified, the codes grew subtler. A cluster of 3 knots might represent the Trinity, while an uneven hem could signal which roads were under patrol. Some garments even employed dual layers, innocent-looking hunting scenes on the outside, with treacherous landscapes stitched into the reverse side of the fabric, visible only when held to light. The true brilliance of these designs lay in their deniability. Unlike written notes that could be used as evidence, embroidered messages could be explained away as decorative whimsy. A guard might confiscate a letter, but who would suspect a grandmother's careful stitches of harboring secrets? This ambiguity gave the cloaks their power. They operated in the liminal space between art and intelligence, too mundane to scrutinize yet too precise to be accidental. Even the choice of materials was strategic. Linen thread, which faded evenly with wear, ensured maps remained legible for months, while wool's natural oils repelled water damage. Some seamstresses went further, using silk for critical details, its slight sheen invisible indoors but catching moonlight to guide night travelers. Every element, from thread thickness to stitch tension, served a purpose beyond aesthetics. Today, these fugitive cloaks remind us that resistance takes many forms. While history books chronicle battles and treaties, these textiles whisper of quieter courage, of women who weaponized their craft to outsmart oppression. Each surviving cloak is a testament to their ingenuity, a fabric palimpsest where faith, geography, and hope were woven into something as ordinary as a winter garment. To study them is to uncover a lost language of survival, one stitch at a time. Sumptuary laws in medieval Europe were meant to enforce social hierarchies, dictating everything from the colors peasants could wear to the fabrics reserved for nobility. But where lawmakers saw control, seamstresses saw opportunity. A servant's plain woolen kirtle, seemingly compliant with regulations, might conceal a rebellious flourish. A noble family's crest stitched in thread so fine it only caught the light at certain angles. A merchant's wife's sleeve, permitted to bear simple embroidery, could hide a subversive detail, a fleur-de-lis tucked into a vine's curl, a silent claim to ancestry the law denied her. These weren't just acts of vanity, they were calculated defiance. In an era when displaying the wrong symbol could mean fines or worse, needlework became a way to bend rules without breaking them. Take the case of Italian silk workers in the 14th century, who responded to sumptuary bans on gold thread by developing a technique called false gold, twisting yellow silk around flax to mimic the forbidden material. From a distance, it dazzled like the real thing, but up close, the deception was a wink to those in the know. The real genius lay in plausible deniability. A seamstress accused of embedding a noble's crest into a commoner's gown could simply point to the design's ambiguity. "That's not a lion rampant, Your Honor, just a stray cat in the brambles." Floral patterns were especially ripe for interpretation. A Tudor rose might pass as mere decoration in England, while in occupied Ireland, the same motif stitched into a cloak's lining became a whisper of allegiance. Even the choice of colors carried coded meaning. Purple, legally restricted to royalty, could be approximated by layering blue and red threads, a visual loophole that turned legal restrictions into creative challenges. Some of the boldest examples come from marginalized communities. Jewish women in medieval Spain, barred from wearing certain fabrics, spun their exclusion into ingenuity. A linen underdress might feature Hebrew blessings embroidered along the seams, wearable prayers that clung to the skin. In Eastern Europe, Roma seamstresses stitched protective symbols into garments, knots to ward off the evil eye, patterns to ensure safe travel, transforming everyday clothing into armor against persecution. What's striking is how these acts of resistance varied by region. In France, where sumptuary laws were notoriously strict, women developed an entire lexicon of accidental embellishments, a dropped stitch that formed a fleur-de-lis, a hem folded just so to reveal a hidden stripe of forbidden silk. Meanwhile, in German towns, guildswomen circumvented fabric restrictions by sewing garments with reversible linings, allowing wearers to flash illicit colors in safe company. These subtle rebellions reveal a truth often lost in grand historical narratives. Oppression breeds innovation. Where written laws spelled out limitations, needlework offered workarounds, a language of threads that legislators couldn't decipher. A woman might never openly defy a king, but her needle could. Every sly stitch was a testament to resilience, a way to carve out identity in the narrow spaces the law left unguarded. Centuries later, we're still unraveling their secrets. That random scatter of stars on a 16th century coif, a map of a family's lost lands, the seemingly haphazard knots in a child's bonnet. A birth record disguised as decoration. These women didn't just clothe their families, they stitched their histories into the fabric of everyday life, ensuring their stories would outlast the laws that tried to silence them. Religious imagery stitched into fabric could be dangerous work. Thread a forbidden saint into your embroidery, and you might pay with your life. Yet throughout history, women found breathtakingly clever ways to keep their faith alive in the folds of their garments. In Elizabethan England, where Catholic symbols were outlawed, a seamstress might stitch a pomegranate, a traditional emblem of the Virgin Mary, into a bed curtains design. To Puritan inspectors, it was just a fruit. To fellow believers, it was a beacon. The techniques they developed were nothing short of genius. Some hid sacred initials in the veins of embroidered leaves, the letters so small they'd blur into the foliage. Others used knot sequences resembling Morse code, 3 tight stitches for a dash, 1 loose for a dot, spelling out prayers like Ave Maria along a collar's edge. In Spain during the Inquisition, women wove Hebrew blessings into the linings of christening gowns, their defiance literally wrapped around the next generation. Even the direction of the stitching held meaning. A row of crosses sewn upside down could signal underground worship, while a seemingly random scattering of stars might map out secret meeting places. One of the most remarkable examples survives in a Czech convent, where nuns facing Protestant persecution stitched an entire band liturgy into altar cloths. At first glance, the textiles depict harmless garden scenes but tilt them toward the light, and the shadows reveal Latin psalms woven into the flower stems. Each petal's curve followed the stroke of a letter, each vine's twist traced a sacred word. These women didn't just preserve their faith, they turned needlework into an act of sacred rebellion, encoding scripture in something as ordinary as table linen. The risks were very real. In 17th century France, Huguenot women caught with Protestant symbols in their samplers faced imprisonment. Yet the closer authorities looked, the more inventive the concealment became. A mourning veil might feature teardrop-shaped stitches that, when counted, corresponded to verses from forbidden translations of the Bible. A child's bonnet could bear 7 embroidered knots, an innocent decoration unless you knew they represented the 7 sacraments banned by reformers. What's astonishing is how these hidden messages crossed cultural boundaries. A Buddhist nun in medieval Japan stitched sutras into the seams of monks' robes, just as Eastern European Jewish women embroidered Kabbalistic symbols into wedding veils. Though the faiths differed, the impulse was the same. When words were forbidden, thread became scripture. Even the materials carried meaning: silk from pilgrimage sites, dyes made from sacred plants, or threads spun during holy days, infusing the cloth with spiritual significance invisible to the untrained eye. These textiles did more than preserve beliefs. They transformed domestic craft into sacred art. A humble mending sampler might contain the entire story of Exodus in its patches, while a noblewoman's sleeve concealed miniature portraits of martyrs. The very act of stitching became prayer, each pull of the needle a meditation, each completed knot an amen. Today, when historians examine these pieces under ultraviolet light or magnifying lenses, they're not just studying embroidery. They're decoding the quiet, relentless courage of women who stitched their souls into history. In the dim glow of a medieval chamber, a young woman might spend months embroidering a single sleeve, not for fashion, but for love. Every stitch carried intention: a rose for passion, ivy for fidelity, and perhaps her beloved's initials hidden in the curling vines. These weren't just gifts, they were wearable love letters, more intimate than any parchment could be. A handkerchief passed between sweethearts might bear a line of verse stitched so finely it could only be read when held to candlelight, while a glove's lining could conceal a lock of hair, sewn into the fabric like a secret pressed between pages. The rituals of courtship textiles were as elaborate as any sonnet. In noble circles, a woman might present her knight with a sleeve before battle, not just as a favor, but as a tangible piece of herself to carry into danger. The embroidery often held coded messages: a tower for steadfastness, a falcon for longing, or a maze whose path led to a single heart-shaped knot. These symbols weren't arbitrary, they followed a shared language of love understood across Europe. A German maiden's belt embroidered with strawberries symbolized sweetness, while an Italian lady's veil might feature pomegranates, a nod to both fertility and the bleeding heart of Christ, blending earthly and divine love in one design. What made these textiles so powerful was their physicality. Unlike a letter that could be burned or intercepted, fabric lived on the body. A lover's initials stitched into a shirt cuff brushed against the wrist with every movement, a constant whisper of affection. Some garments took this intimacy further. A surviving example from Burgundy has a man's doublet lined with his lady's hair, woven into the fabric itself. To modern eyes, it might seem strange, but in a world where relics held power, what could be more sacred than the literal presence of the one you love? The risks only heightened the romance. In arranged marriages or forbidden affairs, these stitched declarations became acts of quiet rebellion. A Tudor servant girl might embroider her yeoman's initials into the hem of her apron, knowing discovery could mean dismissal, yet the very mundanity of the garment protected her. Who would scrutinize a housemaid's laundry? Other lovers grew even more cunning. One 15th century French sleeve features what appears to be a simple hunting scene until you notice the hound's collars bear tiny inscriptions, spelling out a rendezvous location when read in sequence. The fragility of these textiles makes surviving examples all the more precious. Faded threads in a museum case might seem unremarkable, but each one represents a moment suspended in time. The tremor of a needle in nervous fingers, the blush of receiving such a gift, the way fabric absorbed tears when love was lost. Unlike stone monuments or painted portraits, these intimate creations were never meant to last centuries, yet their very perishability makes them truer to the emotions they carried. A love letter in thread was as fleeting and vibrant as the heartbeat that guided its making. Perhaps the most poignant examples come from betrothal trousseaux, where young women stitched their hopes into linens they'd someday share with a husband. A pillowcase might bear intertwined initials, while sheets featured labyrinths, a metaphor for the winding path to marital bliss. But not all these textiles celebrated joy. Some told stories of heartbreak, like the German Spinnrocken distaff cover, embroidered with a grieving maiden and the words, "He left me in May." These pieces remind us that for every sleeve given in hope, there was another folded away in a chest, its message gone unread. The true magic of these love tokens lies in their duality, at once public and private, decorative and deeply personal. A noblewoman's elaborate sleeve might dazzle the court with its craftsmanship, while only her lover knew where to find the hidden stitch marking their first meeting. In a society where romantic expression was often constrained, needlework became the language of desire, one that turned thread into size and fabric into embraces. Today, when we run our fingers over these ancient stitches, we're not just touching art, we're touching the very pulse of medieval hearts. Seamstress guilds in medieval Europe operated like secret societies, except their meetings took place in broad daylight. Their initiates wore thimbles instead of hoods, and their sacred texts were embroidered samplers rather than coded manuscripts. Behind the respectable facade of trade organizations, these guilds safeguarded something far more precious than stitching techniques. They were living libraries of hidden knowledge. A master craftswoman didn't just teach her apprentice how to sew a perfect hem. She showed her how to twist that hem into a cipher, how to nestle a name into the petals of a flower, how to stitch a warning into the lining of a cloak that could save a life. Guild records from cities like Paris, Bruges, and Florence tell part of the story, but only if you know how to read them. Many were written in cipher, with symbols marking not just inventory lists but forbidden techniques. A ledger from a 15th century Lyon silk guild contains what appears to be a mundane list of thread colors until you notice the odd spacing between entries, revealing acrostics pointing to underground worship sites. Another from Ghent uses seemingly random flourishes in the margins that, when traced with a finger, form the outlines of escape routes for persecuted weavers. These weren't accounting errors, they were breadcrumbs left for those who knew where to look. The real magic, though, happened in the spaces between the written word. Techniques for coded embroidery were rarely written down outright. They were passed mouth to ear, hand to hand, in workshops where windows were shuttered against prying eyes. An apprentice might spend years mastering basic stitches before her mentor casually demonstrated how a series of French knots could spell out a name, or how alternating thread thicknesses in a border could indicate distances between safe houses. Some guilds developed entire systems of needlework shorthand. A cross-stitch leaning left meant danger, while one angled right signaled safety. A break in a pattern marked a betrayal, and a cluster of 3 knots was a call for help. What's astonishing is how these practices varied by region yet shared core principles. Venetian seamstresses working with luxurious silks developed techniques for hiding messages in the sheen of their stitches, words that only appeared when fabric caught the light at certain angles. Meanwhile, in the wool-producing regions of England, women used the natural variations in undyed yarn to create textures that conveyed information through touch rather than sight. A blind beggar might run his fingers over a cloak's edge and read whether the wearer was friend or foe, all while authorities remained none the wiser. The Guild's greatest strength was their adaptability. When authorities in Reformation-era Germany banned certain symbols, the Nuremberg Seamstress Guild responded by developing an entirely new visual language, turning common household objects into covert signals. A teapot in an embroidery pattern might represent a meeting place, while scissors indicated danger. In Spain, Jewish and Muslim seamstresses facing persecution used knotting techniques from their respective traditions to create hybrid codes that neither group could have devised alone. These innovations didn't just preserve cultural identity, they forged new ones in the crucible of necessity. Yet for all their ingenuity, much of this knowledge has evaporated like morning mist. Without written records, many techniques died with their practitioners. We catch glimpses in odd places, a cryptic note tucked into a guild ledger here, a sampler with inexplicable stitch variations there, but the full scope of what these women knew may never be recovered. That's what makes surviving examples so precious. A single embroidered panel from a Strasbourg guild hall contains 7 distinct coding methods layered into its design, a masterclass in covert communication that modern cryptographers are still unraveling. The true legacy of these guilds isn't just in the messages they preserved, but in the radical idea they embodied, that needlework could be as powerful as any sword, that a woman's hands might quietly shape history while the world was busy watching kings and bishops. Their samplers were manifestos, their stitches were signatures, and their threads wove together a counter-narrative to the official record, one that insisted, stitch by stubborn stitch, that women's stories mattered. The vibrant world of medieval textiles wasn't just about beauty, it was a secret language written in color. Every hue carried weight, every shade a message, and the women who mastered these dyes held power in their hands. Take indigo, for instance. More than just a rich blue, it symbolized truth and wisdom across cultures, from the robes of European scholars to the veils of Middle Eastern storytellers. But achieving that perfect shade wasn't simple. The finest indigo came from distant lands, traded at premium prices, and the recipes for fixing it into fabric were whispered like state secrets. A seamstress who could produce a lasting blue wasn't just a craftswoman, she was a keeper of knowledge, her vats as guarded as an alchemist's laboratory. Then there was saffron yellow, a color as dangerous as it was dazzling. Derived from the delicate stigmas of crocus flowers, it took 75,000 blossoms to yield a single pound of dye, making it worth its weight in gold. In some courts, wearing saffron-dyed silk signaled immense wealth, while in others it hinted at betrayal. A noblewoman might don a saffron-lined cloak to subtly accuse a rival of treachery, letting the fabric speak where words would be too risky. Even the intensity of the yellow carried meaning: pale for caution, deep for defiance, a gradient of emotion stitched into every fold. But the real artistry lay in combinations. A green wasn't just green, it could be sorrow or renewal, depending on whether it leaned toward fern-dyed emerald or the murkier tones of weld mixed with iron. In Baltic regions, brides wore red and white ribbons twisted together, symbolizing the interweaving of two lives, while widows in medieval Spain draped themselves in gradations of purple and black, the depth of mourning measured in the subtlest shifts of hue. Some colors were so potent they crossed into the realm of magic. Woad-dyed blue, believed to repel evil spirits, was stitched into children's clothing as protective talismans. In Scandinavia, rune-inscribed belts featured red threads dyed with madder root, a color associated with both blood and life force, turning everyday garments into sacred objects. The process itself was ritual. Dyes brewed under specific moon phases, threads soaked in prayers as much as pigments. What's fascinating is how these codes traveled. A Venetian merchant's ledger might list Persian red as a commodity, but to the women working the threads, it carried stories of faraway deserts and the crushed insects that bled their crimson onto silk. A single bolt of cloth could whisper of trade routes, political alliances, even religious schisms like the Great Divide between Catholic and Protestant Europe, where the choice between cochineal red associated with papal splendor or modest plant-based dyes became a silent declaration of faith. The fragility of these colors only heightened their meaning. Fugitive dyes, those that faded quickly, were perfect for messages meant to be temporary, a courtship token designed to vanish after a season, or a protest symbol stitched into a banner meant to dissolve after its purpose was served. Meanwhile, the rarest hues were engineered to endure. Tyrian purple, extracted from Mediterranean sea snails, was so color-fast that robes dyed 2,000 years ago still retain their regal luster. Wearing it wasn't just about display, it was a claim on eternity. Today, when historians analyze these textiles under spectral imaging, they're not just studying chemistry, they're decoding emotions. That faint blush on a wedding gown sleeve, not age, but original intent, a barely their pink made from crushed roses, symbolizing bashful love, the strange brown streaking a nun's habit. Not deterioration, but deliberate use of walnut hulls, their tannins believed to strengthen spiritual resolve. Every faded thread has a story, and together they paint a picture far richer than any surviving manuscript. The true mastery of these dyers and seamstresses lay in their understanding of context. The same crimson that celebrated a birth in one culture might mourn a death in another. A shade acceptable in daylight could become subversive by candlelight. They worked in the liminal space between seen and unseen, crafting messages that danced on the edge of perception, a language where the most powerful words were never spoken aloud but worn. In the quiet corners of medieval courts and village squares, some of history's most binding contracts weren't signed with ink, they were sewn with thread. Imagine a land dispute settled not with a wax seal, but with an embroidered tapestry depicting the contested fields, every boundary line stitched in gold, every tree and stream rendered in precise detail. These weren't just illustrations, they were legally binding deeds as authoritative as any parchment. In cultures from the Andes to the Baltic, textiles functioned as courtroom evidence, marriage certificates, even last wills, documents meant to outlast generations because, unlike paper, thread doesn't fade easily and tampering leaves obvious scars. Take the Icelandic vadmál cloth, a rough woolen fabric that doubled as currency and contract. A land transfer might involve cutting a strip from a specially woven bolt, the unique weave pattern serving as a fingerprint, impossible to replicate exactly. If challenged, the pieces could be matched like puzzle fragments, proving authenticity. Similarly, in parts of medieval Russia, marriage agreements were embroidered with symbols representing dowries: a horse for the groom's family, a sheaf of wheat for the bride's, the stitches so dense and intricate that altering them would require dismantling the entire cloth. The message was clear: this union was as unbreakable as the threads holding it together. The brilliance of these textile contracts lay in their democratic nature. Where written legal documents required scribes and Latin, a language few commoners understood, embroidered agreements spoke visually. A Finnish fishing rights document might feature embroidered fish leaping along a blue-threaded river, with knots marking each family's allotted stretch. No words needed, the imagery was the law. Even disputes could be read from the fabric. A torn edge might indicate a broken promise, while a clumsily repaired section could expose fraud. Some of the most striking examples come from the Andes, where Inca quipus knotted cords recorded everything from tax obligations to census data. But less known are the curus, woven textiles that encoded legal narratives. A kuru depicting a mountain with terraced fields wasn't just art, It was a title deed, with specific patterns denoting ownership rights passed down through generations. The Spanish conquistadors, baffled by these picture books, often dismissed them as primitive, failing to grasp how every crosshatch and color shift represented clauses and conditions as nuanced as any notary's ledger. In Europe, the Bayeux tapestry's cousin, the lesser-known Baldachol tapestry from Norway, served a similar purpose. Woven with scenes of farming and hunting, it wasn't just decorative, it codified seasonal land use rights among villagers. The spring pasture appeared in green wool, the autumn hunting grounds in russet, each section's border stitches corresponding to a family's traditional access days. To modern eyes, it looks like folk art, but to its creators, it was a meticulously maintained legal calendar. What's remarkable is how these textile documents resisted corruption. A parchment deed could be scraped clean and rewritten, but a tampered tapestry bore visible wounds, pulled threads, mismatched dyes, uneven tension. In 13th century France, a nobleman famously tried to claim his sister's dowry lands by altering their mother's embroidered will. The court spotted the fraud instantly. The replacement stitches used a different shade of madder red, and the back of the fabric showed where original threads had been yanked out. The cloth itself became the star witness. These practices reveal a profound truth about pre-modern societies. They understood that law lives not just in words but in things. A quilt stitched with inheritance terms wasn't just a record. It was the physical embodiment of a family's legacy, something to be unfolded and explained to each new generation. A treaty between clans, woven as interlocking patterns on a shared banner, made peace tangible. You could literally hold the agreement in your hands. Today, as historians rediscover these textile archives, they're realizing how much legal history has been hiding in plain sight. That decorative border on a medieval German altar cloth, it's actually the terms of a vineyard sale, with grape clusters representing payment in wine. The seemingly random geometric patterns on a Berber wedding blanket, their prenuptial terms spelling out property rights in a visual language only the community's women could fully decipher. These weren't just crafts, they were contracts woven with the threads of trust, designed to endure long after the people who made them were gone. The invention of the printing press didn't just change how books were made, it unraveled an entire language of thread. As ink-stamped pages spread across Europe, the painstaking art of textile storytelling began to seem quaint, even obsolete. Why spend months embroidering a family's history into a tapestry when you could scribe it in an hour? What had once been a vital form of record-keeping slowly became women's work, dismissed as decorative rather than documentary. The seamstresses who'd once been silent historians found themselves recast as mere laborers, their needles stripped of meaning. But the shift wasn't just about efficiency. Written records carried an authority that fabric couldn't match, at least in the eyes of those who controlled them. A property deed on parchment bore the weight of legal institutions, while an embroidered land contract, no matter how detailed, could be waved away as folk art. The very qualities that made textiles powerful, their flexibility, their intimacy, now worked against them. A book could be copied exactly, distributed widely, but a stitched message was one of a kind, its meaning often locked within a single community's traditions. Yet, even as their craft was marginalized, seamstresses clung to fragments of their old role. In rural areas where literacy spread slowly, textile narratives persisted well into the 18th century. A Swedish bride might still weave her dowry inventory into her wedding blanket, the woolen threads doubling as a ledger. German midwives kept birth records in embroidered panels, with each knot representing a child delivered. These practices weren't just holdovers, they were acts of quiet defiance, a refusal to let go of a language that had served women for centuries. the real tragedy lies in what was lost in the transition. Written records favored the powerful, the landowners, the clergy, the male heads of household. Textiles had been democracy in thread, a way for the illiterate, the marginalized, and the disenfranchised to leave their mark. A servant girl's initials stitched into a bed sheet might be the only proof she ever existed, while her master's name filled volumes of parish registers. The decline of textile storytelling didn't just change how history was recorded, it changed whose history was deemed worth remembering. Today, historians are piecing together these fragments like a scattered embroidery hoop. In a French convent attic, a trunk of linens turned out to contain a nun's coded chronicle of the Reformation, her stitches capturing events too dangerous to write down. A quilt from colonial Virginia, long dismissed as a simple bed cover, revealed itself to be a map of underground railroad routes, its patterns matching oral histories of escaped slaves. Every rediscovery forces us to reconsider what counts as a reliable source and who gets to decide. The irony is rich. The very medium that was once dismissed as ephemeral has outlasted countless parchments. Ink fades, paper crumbles, but threads preserved in chests and crypts still whisper their secrets. A single surviving sampler might hold generations of a family's lore, while volumes of official records turn to dust. The seamstress's greatest revenge is time itself, their women's work, enduring long after the scribe's permanent records have vanished. What's left now are the echoes, a grandmother teaching a child to cross-stitch letters, not realizing she's passing down a cipher from the Middle Ages. A museum conservator spotting odd tension in a stitch, realizing it's not a mistake but a message. These threads connect us to a world where history wasn't just written, it was worn, slept under, held close. And somewhere in an undiscovered chest or forgotten attic, another textile waits, its story coiled in the twist of a thread, ready to be read at last. Today, the quiet revolution of medieval seamstresses is finding new voices not in thread, but in technology. Historians armed with multispectral imaging cameras are uncovering messages invisible to the naked eye, revealing words and symbols that have lain dormant for centuries. A seemingly plain linen shift from 17th century England, when scanned under infrared light, suddenly blooms with names and dates stitched in thread now too faint to see, a mother's record of births and deaths preserved in the very fabric that once touched her skin. This isn't just academic curiosity, it's a form of justice. For too long, textiles were sidelined as domestic artifacts rather than historical documents. Now, collaborations between scientists and art historians are proving what the stitches always whispered, that these works belong alongside parchments and chronicles as vital records of the past. The Victoria and Albert Museum's recent project analyzing Elizabethan smocks revealed prayers embroidered in reverse stitching visible only from the inside, where they would have brushed against the wearer's heart. Contemporary textile artists are taking up the mantle, blending ancient techniques with modern mediums. In Denmark, artist Han Hedegaard stitches QR codes into tapestries using medieval knotting methods, scannable links to oral histories hidden in the patterns. Meanwhile, in Mexico City, the Bordando Feminicides Collective embroiders the names of violence victims onto public spaces, turning the tradition of protest stitching into a visceral memorial. Their work echoes the clandestine messages of medieval seamstresses, proving thread remains a potent language for the silenced. The real breakthrough lies in how museums are rethinking display methods. Gone are the days of static labels beside glass cases. At the Clothworkers Centre in London, visitors can handle replica garments stitched with coded messages, tracing hidden initials with their fingertips. Interactive light panels at the Musée de Cluny let viewers unpick digital embroidery to reveal layer upon layer of meaning, from laundry marks to love notes. These innovations do more than educate, they restore agency to the seamstresses, letting their long-overlooked voices finally be heard. Scholarship is catching up too. Universities now offer courses on textile literacy, teaching students to read cloth as they would manuscripts. A groundbreaking study at Cambridge recently deciphered a network of symbols in medieval German aprons, a shared visual language among midwives that recorded birth complications and remedies. Another team discovered that certain stitches in Byzantine silk functioned like musical notation, with the spacing between threads indicating pitch and rhythm for hymns. What's emerging is nothing short of a paradigm shift. Every time a conservator discovers a new cipher or an artist revives an old technique, the historical narrative expands. A nun's sampler becomes a feminist manifesto. A merchant's ledger transforms into a spy's handbook. The quiet work of women's hands, once dismissed as trivial, is rewriting history, one stitch at a time. Perhaps the most poignant resurrection is happening in communities where these traditions never fully died. In rural Bulgaria, elderly women still teach the writing stitch to grandchildren, passing down alphabets woven into wool. A cooperative in Morocco trains survivors of violence in ancestral embroidery codes, turning trauma into art that carries their stories forward. These living threads bridge past and present, proving that needle and thread remain powerful tools, not just for preserving history, but for making it. The true measure of this revival lies in its humility. Unlike grand monuments or official records, textile storytelling has always been intimate, tactile, fleeting. A message stitched into a collar may only be seen by the wearer. A plea hidden in a quilt's batting might wait generations to be found. Yet in their quiet persistence, these threads outlast empires. They remind us that history isn't just written by those who shout loudest sometimes, it's sewn by those who simply refuse to be erased. Deciphering a historical garment begins with training your eye to see beyond the surface. That floral pattern on an 18th century waistcoat might appear decorative until you notice how certain blossoms repeat in clusters of 3, a possible nod to the Holy Trinity. Irregularities are rarely accidents. A seamstress might intentionally twist a vine's curl into the shape of a letter, or use an unexpected pop of crimson in an otherwise muted palette to mark a significant date. Even the smallest details carry weight. A stitch slanting left instead of right could signal distress, while a series of French knots might encode a name when counted. Start by examining the borders. The edges of collars, cuffs, and hems were prime real estate for hidden messages. A sampler from colonial New England, for instance, features a seemingly innocent row of alphabets along its edge. But look closer, every fifth letter is slightly raised, spelling out a Bible verse when read vertically. Similarly, the direction of embroidery can reveal intent. Stitches radiating outward like sunbeams might symbolize hope, while those converging inward could represent protection. Color choices are another cipher. In a world where dyes were expensive and labor-intensive, every hue was deliberate. A splash of indigo in an otherwise earthy-toned quilt might trace a river on a freedom seeker's map, while faded green threads could outline forgotten property boundaries. Pay attention to wear patterns too. Areas rubbed thin from touch, like the corner of a handkerchief or a sleeve's inner lining, often held the most intimate messages, cherished into near oblivion. Textile conservators have developed tricks to uncover these secrets. Holding fabric at an angle under raking light can expose subtle variations in stitch tension, revealing words or symbols invisible head-on. Ultraviolet light sometimes resurrects faded dyes, like the once vibrant saffron threads in a medieval coif that spelled a forbidden prayer. Even the back of a piece holds clues. A messy reverse side might indicate haste, while meticulously finished knots suggest sacred intent. But the true magic lies in context. A rose embroidered on a Tudor glove could symbolize the monarchy, unless it's paired with a hidden thorn, a whispered critique of royal cruelty. A Norse mitten adorned with interlocking wolves might seem decorative until you learn the wearer was a skald, his stitches preserving a lost stanza of poetry about Fenrir. These layers of meaning transform textiles into palimpsests, their stories waiting for someone patient enough to read between the threads. So next time you encounter an antique textile, resist the urge to dismiss it as mere craft. Run your fingers along its seams not just to feel the texture, but to follow the pulse of the hands that made it, that irregular stitch, a tremor of emotion. That faded spot, a memory worn smooth by love. Every thread is a sentence, every knot a punctuation mark in a story we're only beginning to understand. There's something quietly radical about a needle and thread. For centuries, embroidery was dismissed as trivial domestic labor confined to the margins of history, much like the women who practiced it. But today, contemporary artists are reclaiming those stitches as acts of defiance, threading feminist narratives into every loop and knot. Take Judy Chicago's iconic dinner party, where 39 meticulously embroidered place settings honor forgotten women of history, their names glowing in thread like resurrected voices. Each stitch is a correction, a way of saying, we were here all along. This revival isn't just about aesthetics, it's about power. Medieval seamstresses encoded protests in their work because they had no other platform. Modern artists do it because they refuse to be platformed on anyone else's terms. The Guerrilla Girls, known for their provocative art activism, once stitched their signature gorilla masks onto vintage handkerchiefs, turning a symbol of domesticity into a banner of rebellion. In Mexico, the collective Bordemos Feminicidios embroiders the names of murdered women onto public spaces, forcing society to confront violence it would rather ignore. Their needles are their megaphones. What's striking is how these modern movements mirror medieval practices. When a 13th century nun stitched biblical heroines into altar cloths, she wasn't just decorating, she was centering women in a narrative that erased them. Today, artists like Sarah Kay, Benning recreate that subversion with embroidered scenes of women reading, working, and thriving independently, their stitches as deliberate as any manifesto. Even the materials carry echoes of the past. Some artists deliberately use vintage linens or unraveled historical textiles, weaving their work literally into the fabric of earlier generations. The craft itself has become a metaphor. Embroidery's slow, repetitive nature, once used to dismiss it as mindless, is now celebrated as meditative resistance. In a world obsessed with speed, choosing to spend hours hand-stitching is an act of reclamation. Artist Michelle Caraca, who embroidered costumes for Game of Thrones, describes how her intricate goldwork for Queen Cersei's gowns mirrored the character's calculated patience, every thread a plotted move. Meanwhile, communities like the Subversive Stitch Collective host stitch-ins, where participants embroider slogans over misogynistic vintage patterns, transforming oppressive relics into declarations of autonomy. Perhaps most powerfully, this revival challenges who gets to decide what counts as art. For years, galleries dismissed textile work as craft, relegating it to folk museums rather than fine art spaces. But when artist Tracy Emin displays her chaotic, confessional embroideries alongside paintings, she forces the question, why is one medium valued over another? Her raw, misspelled stitches, sometimes blurry with tears, hold an emotional honesty that polished oil paintings often lack. It's a direct descendant of medieval mourning veils, where grief was woven into the very threads that touched a widow's skin. The thread connecting these artists across time isn't just metaphorical. Many contemporary practitioners study historical techniques, reviving stitches like opus anglicanum, the dazzling goldwork perfected by medieval English nuns, to tell modern stories. When Ghanaian artist Serge Atukwe Clotty stitches discarded plastic containers into tapestries, he's using the same knotting methods once employed to map trade routes in fabric, only now charting the global flow of waste. The tools haven't changed, but the conversations they spark have. This movement isn't confined to galleries. Social media has turned embroidery into a viral language of resistance. Instagram feeds overflow with hoops featuring slogans like "Nevertheless, she persisted," or anatomical hearts stitched with the names of feminist icons. Some artists even hide QR codes in their embroidery, linking to oral histories or protest resources, a high-tech twist on medieval seamstresses knotting prayers into hems. The medium's intimacy makes it potent. A protest banner can be torn down, but a handkerchief stitched with "My body, my choice" slips into a pocket, carried close like the medieval love tokens hidden in sleeve linings. What unites these artists past and present is the understanding that thread is never just thread. Every stitch is a decision, every color a declaration. When a medieval seamstress embroidered a fox stealing a chicken, she might have been critiquing a corrupt lord. When a modern artist stitches a uterus onto a Supreme Court robe pattern, the message is just as deliberate. The medium's supposed fragility is its strength. Fabric wears, fades, and frays, just like the lives it documents. But as long as there are needles, there will be women willing to prick the surface of history and sew their truths into the gaps. The delicate nature of textiles means every surviving encoded garment is a minor miracle. Unlike stone carvings or metal artifacts that endure for millennia, fabric crumbles at the whisper of time. A medieval cloak that once held secret messages in its embroidery might now exist only as a few discolored threads clinging to a museum display, its story fraying into silence. The very qualities that made cloth such a perfect medium for covert communication, its lightness, its intimacy, also made it tragically ephemeral. A love letter stitched into a sleeve cuff might survive a century of gentle wear, only to disintegrate when a well-meaning curator brushes against it during preservation. Climate change has turned this slow decay into a crisis. Fluctuations in temperature and humidity cause fibers to expand and contract like gasping lungs, weakening their structure with every breath. In Norway, a 12th century tapestry depicting runic symbols began literally unraveling when unseasonable dampness seeped into its storage vault. Meanwhile, rising global temperatures accelerate chemical reactions in centuries-old dyes, transforming once vibrant protest symbols into ghostly stains. The infamous blood shirt of Swedish rebel Engelbrekt, its crimson stitches detailing plans for uprising, now resembles pale pink watercolor, its revolutionary fervor fading with every summer heatwave. Storage conditions often compound the damage. Many priceless textiles spent decades folded in attic trunks or church sacristies, their creases becoming permanent fractures. A Tudor-era handkerchief embroidered with Catholic martyrs' names was discovered folded into eighths, the pressure causing its threads to sever along the folds like a map of deliberate erasure. Even modern museums struggle. 19th century conservation techniques sometimes did more harm than good, like the Victorian practice of starching fragile lace, which left behind corrosive residues still eating away at the fabric today. Conservationists now race against time with tools both high-tech and humble. At the Louvre, scientists developed a nanofiber, skin, that stabilizes crumbling silk without obscuring its stitches, a nearly invisible scaffold preserving both fabric and message. In Peru, where ancient Quipus knotted cord records face extinction, researchers use 3D imaging to map each knot's precise tension before the fibers turn to dust. Some solutions are surprisingly low-tech. A team in Iceland successfully preserved a rare coded apron by storing it in a sealed box with raw sheep's wool, the lanolin acting as a natural stabilizer passed down from Viking-age textile workers. The urgency extends beyond museums. Private collections hold untold treasures vulnerable to neglect, like the Welsh farmhouse where a Civil War-era quilt mapping royalist escape routes was nearly used as a horse blanket before historians intervened. Oral traditions are vanishing too, taking with them the keys to deciphering these textiles. When the last practitioner of a Sicilian knot language died in 2018, she took knowledge of hundreds of anti-fascist messages stitched into wartime linens, their meanings now locked in thread. Yet there's poetry in the struggle. Every textile conservator becomes a sort of cryptographer, not just preserving physical objects but wrestling with their contradictions. To save a piece, they must often restrain it, pinning fragile fragments under UV filtering glass, knowing future generations may develop better techniques. It's a peculiar grief. The very act of protection creates distance, turning garments meant to be touched and worn into untouchable artifacts. That Tudor handkerchief will never again wipe tears from its owner's cheek, but perhaps suspended in its climate-controlled case, it can still weep its story for those who know how to look. What's at stake isn't just fabric, but the voices woven into it. Each disintegrating sampler represents a lifetime of decisions, which stories to risk preserving, which symbols to hide in plain sight. When we lose these threads, we don't just lose artifacts, we lose the hands that held them, the eyes that decoded them, the lives they sheltered. The race to save them isn't about nostalgia, it's about restoring a chorus of whispers too long drowned out by the louder narratives of history. Want to leave your own mark in thread? Creating hidden messages in embroidery is easier than you might think, and you don't need medieval-level skills to start. Begin with something simple, a single initial or a small symbol meaningful to you. Tuck it into the corner of a handkerchief or the cuff of a sleeve, just like seamstresses did centuries ago. The magic lies in blending it seamlessly into a larger pattern, maybe a vine that curls into the shape of a letter, or a cluster of flowers where one petal forms a heart. Historical stitches add an extra layer of connection to the past. Try the Algerian eye, a star-like stitch used in Islamic embroidery to symbolize protection, or the feather stitch, a favorite of Victorian botanists for its leafy texture. These aren't just techniques, they're threads to another time. When your needle pulls through the fabric, you're joining a lineage of crafters who turned everyday objects into storytellers. For a truly authentic touch, experiment with color symbolism. Scarlet thread could represent courage, blue for truth, or green for growth, just as medieval dyers infused hues with meaning. Hide a message by switching to a slightly different shade in the middle of a pattern, something only noticeable up close, or borrow from Tudor seamstresses and use stitch direction as code. Vertical for yes, horizontal for wait, diagonal for danger. The beauty of this practice is that imperfection tells its own story. A slightly uneven line might mirror the tremor in a 17th century nun's hand as she stitched forbidden prayers. A knot left visible could echo the urgency of a Huguenot's escape map. Your work doesn't need museum-quality precision to carry meaning. Sometimes, the most powerful messages are the ones that show the hand of the maker. And who knows, centuries from now, someone might hold your embroidery under a light, discovering the tiny heart you hid in a bouquet or the initials woven into a border. Your stitches could become their window into the past, just as medieval textiles are ours. Every knot, every twist of thread is a conversation across time, one that starts with a simple needle and the courage to say, "I was here." Dr. Elena Voss holds up a seemingly ordinary child's bonnet from the 18th century, its edges yellowed with age. At first glance, it's just a piece of infant clothing, she says, turning it gently in her hands. But look here along the hem, barely visible, are tiny stitches forming letters. The camera zooms in, revealing the word "remember" repeated in a delicate spiral. This wasn't sentimental decoration. It was stitched by a mother during the Jacobite uprisings, her husband imprisoned after the rebellion. Every time she dressed her child, she was literally wrapping them in resistance. Textile historians like Voss are uncovering these hidden narratives one thread at a time. Professor Javier Mendez recounts his discovery of a 16th century pilgrim's cloak in a Spanish monastery. The embroidery appeared to depict generic vines and flowers, he explains, but when we mapped the patterns against medieval pilgrimage routes, the stems aligned perfectly with the Camino de Santiago. Each blossom marked a safe haven or freshwater spring, a wearable guide for travelers who couldn't read. The cloak's lining held even more secrets, microscopic knots tied at intervals corresponding to days of travel, a tactile calendar for the journey. What astonishes researchers most is how much remains undeciphered. Dr. Linh Tran, studying Vietnamese resistance textiles, describes a quilt from the 1940s with symbols so obscure that elders in the region now in their 90s can only recall fragments of their meaning. Certain stitches represented bomb shelters, others marked informants, she says, tracing the fading indigo lines. But without the living memory of those who stitched them, parts of this map are lost forever. This urgency drives historians to collaborate with communities, recording oral traditions before they vanish. The field is full of tantalizing mysteries. A Baltic apron stored in a Danish archive bears intricate geometric patterns that, when analyzed mathematically, mirror constellation charts used by medieval navigators. Was this a sailor's wife encoding star paths for her husband, wonders historian Ingrid Brandt, or a covert way to teach astronomy during periods when women were barred from formal education? Even the tools of textile analysis are evolving. Multispectral imaging recently revealed nearly invisible ink annotations on a Tudor-era sampler, notes scribbled by the embroiderer herself, correcting a pattern's errors like a medieval editor. Perhaps most moving are the discoveries that rewrite small corners of history. A lace collar in a Milan museum, long attributed to a noblewoman, was found under ultraviolet light to contain the initials S.M. and a date likely Sister Margherita, a nun known for smuggling messages in her needlework during the Counter-Reformation. We're used to thinking of historical records as ledgers and letters, reflects Voss. But sometimes the most truthful accounts were those hidden in plain sight, stitched by hands the world chose not to see. The work is painstaking. Conservator Amir Hassan describes spending 6 months reconstructing a single square inch of a Kurdish martyr's banner, its threads shredded by time and conflict. Each color was chosen deliberately: red for sacrifice, green for homeland, black for mourning. To repair it isn't just preservation, it's an act of remembrance. These textiles demand patience, humility. A single misstep in handling can erase centuries of encoded meaning, like a library crumbling to dust at a touch. What keeps historians digging through archives and attics is the promise of voices still waiting to be heard. A recent find in a Scottish castle, a tapestry long dismissed as amateurish, was discovered to contain Morse code-like stitches along its borders, likely a servant's secret chronicle of household abuses. Every textile is a palimpsest, says Mendes. You peel back one layer and find 10 more beneath. The greatest lesson these scholars emphasize, that history isn't just written by those who held the pen, but by those who held the needle, and their stories, however faint, refuse to unravel. There's a quiet tension in the way sunlight falls across an embroidered message hidden for centuries. Do we pull at its threads, or let it rest? This question lies at the heart of textile conservation, where every decision to decode risks unraveling not just stitches, but the very privacy these women fought to protect. Consider the case of a 17th-century nightgown discovered in a French convent. It's hemmed dense with tiny, chaotic stitches. At first, researchers assumed it was haphazard mending, until magnification revealed a nun's frantic account of a priest's abuse, scribbled in thread during sleepless nights. The dilemma was immediate: publish her story and validate her suffering, or honor what might have been her last attempt to bury the trauma with her. This isn't just about historical curiosity, it's about consent across time. Medieval seamstresses often stitched secrets into garments meant to cling to skin-loved notes in chemises, prayers in swaddling bands, protests in the linings of mourning veils. These weren't declarations for the public, they were intimate confessions, sometimes even dangerous ones. Uncovering them can feel like reading a diary left open on a bedside table, an invasion the writer never anticipated. When a team in Ghent reconstructed a 16th-century bodice and found a list of names embroidered upside down against the wearer's ribs, they debated for months whether to display it. Those names likely identified heretics in a time when exposure meant execution. Was revealing them now a tribute to their bravery or a betrayal of their caution? Yet there's another side to this ethical knot. Many seamstresses took extraordinary risks to ensure their messages survived. A Jewish midwife in medieval Spain encoded birth records into a tapestry's border, knowing her community's history might otherwise vanish. A Huguenot woman spent years stitching a map of escape routes into a bed curtain, willing her hands to tremble so the pattern would look accidental. For these women, concealment wasn't about privacy, it was about preservation under threat. Not decoding their work might mean failing the very people who threaded their hopes into fabric, trusting future generations to listen. The debate grows even thornier with spiritual textiles. In Tibet, monks create intricate sand mandalas only to destroy them, teaching impermanence. But what of the embroidered mandalas sewn by Buddhist nuns, their threads lasting centuries? Is displaying them a celebration of devotion or a violation of their transient philosophy? Similar questions arise with indigenous quippers, where knots record everything from tax records to ancestral stories. Some Andean communities argue these should remain undeciphered by outsiders, their meanings reserved for descendants. Others believe sharing them honors indigenous resilience against cultural erasure. Perhaps the answer lies in context, not just what's hidden, but why it was hidden and for whom. When curators at the Museum of London studied a Victorian servant's apron embroidered with the word "liar" along its seam, they chose to display it with a mirror. Visitors could bend to read the insult, recreating the angle at which the wearer's employer might have glimpsed it, a subtle act of defiance meant to be seen only fleetingly. This approach respects the original intent. The message was always meant to provoke, just on its own terms. Technology complicates the equation. High-resolution scans and AI pattern recognition can now detect micro-stitches invisible to the human eye, messages the seamstress might have assumed would fade forever. Is it ethical to expose what was designed to dissolve? Some museums have begun reburying certain textiles after study, folding them so their secrets return to darkness. Others create digital surrogates, allowing the public to explore hidden layers while the physical artifact remains respectfully closed. In the end, every textile is a conversation not just between past and present, but between the living and the dead. The medieval woman who stitched her grief into a handkerchief, the enslaved girl who knotted directions to freedom into a quilt's border, the nun who wove heresy into an altar cloth, they all made choices about what to share and what to shield. Our responsibility isn't just to uncover their voices, but to listen as they intended, sometimes leaning in close, sometimes knowing when to step back and let the silence speak. Technology now peers over the shoulders of medieval seamstresses, not to replace their craft, but to finally hear their whispers. Artificial intelligence has become the unexpected ally of textile historians, analyzing stitches with a precision no human eye could sustain. At the University of Cambridge, a neural network trained on thousands of embroidery samples recently deciphered a pattern in a Flemish tapestry that had baffled experts for decades. A series of irregular stitches that, when mapped in 3 dimensions, formed musical notation for a lost hymn. The machine didn't just recognize the pattern, it sang the melody, resurrecting a song silenced for 500 years. What makes these digital tools revolutionary is their ability to see connections across vast distances. A team at the Metropolitan Museum of Art used machine learning to compare dye compositions in fragments of Coptic textiles from Egypt and 6th century Irish monastic vestments. The algorithm spotted identical chemical signatures in both, revealing a previously unknown trade route for madder root pigment, proof that Mediterranean red was traveling to the edge of Europe while Rome crumbled. Suddenly, a humble scrap of fabric could rewrite chapters of economic history. Yet the real magic happens when technology meets tactile tradition. In Barcelona, conservators combined spectral imaging with hands-on stitching techniques passed down through generations. They discovered that a series of flaws in a 15th century altar cloth slight puckers in the linen were actually tiny pockets containing seeds and soil samples. The seamstress had embroidered an agricultural calendar into the sacred textile, her stitches preserving not just prayer, but the very earth her community depended on. AI mapped the soil types to specific fields outside the city walls, while human hands recognized the sewing style as unique to a convent known for its herbalists. Some of the most poignant breakthroughs come from restoring what time tried to erase. A project at the Victoria and Albert Museum employs hyperspectral cameras to detect vanished threads in Tudor-era samplers. One such scan revealed the ghostly outline of a baby's handprint stitched in silver thread, now tarnished to near invisibility beside the words, "Born and buried May 1583. The mother's grief, once hidden by oxidation, now pulses across centuries with unbearable immediacy. Elsewhere, algorithms reconstruct disintegrating silk threads in Mogul shawls, not just preserving their beauty, but revealing how certain knot patterns served as territorial maps for nomadic weavers. The limitations of these tools, though, reveal as much as their triumphs. A Japanese research team trained an AI to analyze Edo period kimonos for hidden symbols, only to discover the machine kept misreading intentional imperfections. What the algorithm dismissed as errors, a deliberately crooked line, a stitch left loose, were actually subtle critiques of shogunate laws, woven into the fabric by artisans with no other outlet for dissent. The very flaws the AI filtered out were the message. It took a 90-year-old master embroiderer to explain, sometimes rebellion looks like a mistake. This collaboration between silicon and thread is rewriting conservation ethics. At the Louvre, delicate touch gloves equipped with microsensors now allow curators to feel embroidery through a robotic interface, their fingers registering textures too fragile for direct contact. Meanwhile, in Guatemala, Maya weavers use augmented reality apps to overlay ancestral patterns onto modern looms, blending millennia of knowledge with real-time correction. The past isn't just being preserved, it's in dialogue with the present, each informing the other. Perhaps the most humbling realization is how much remains beyond digital reach. A research group at Oxford spent 2 years teaching an AI to recognize medieval mending techniques, only to uncover stitches so personal they defied categorization, the erratic repairs of a grieving widow, her hands shaking as she reinforced her husband's favorite tunic after his death. The machine could map every irregularity, but only a human could recognize the tremor of sorrow in those threads. In the end, technology doesn't replace the seamstresses' voices, it amplifies them, letting us hear layers of meaning we never knew to listen for. While European seamstresses stitched secrets into cloaks halfway across the world, Japanese brides were weaving wishes into the very threads of their kimonos. A vibrant uchacake wedding robe might dazzle with embroidered cranes and flowers, but hidden in the lining, barely visible silk threads could spell out prayers for fertility or long life, knotted in patterns resembling ancient temple charms. These weren't just decorations, they were whispered hopes pressed between layers of fabric, meant to cling to the skin like a second heartbeat. In Kyoto, artisans still practice this tradition, passing down the belief that certain stitch sequences can ward off misfortune, their needles moving with the precision of scribes writing in thread. Venture to the Andes, and you'll find an even more astonishing fiber language: quipus, intricate knotted cords used by the Inca to record everything from tax records to epic poetry. At first glance, they resemble colorful tassels, but each knot's position, size, and hue held specific meanings. A tight knot at the top might represent a king's birth, while a series of looser knots below could tally grain stores. Some scholars argue certain quipus encoded narratives as complex as Homer's Odyssey, their stories told not in ink but in the twist of alpaca wool. What's remarkable is how these cords functioned across languages, allowing communication between Quechua, Aymara, and other cultures under Inca rule, proof that thread could unite as powerfully as it could conceal. Across the Pacific, Hawaiian copper makers beat mulberry bark into cloth, then stamped it with dyes made from sacred plants. These patterns weren't arbitrary. They mapped genealogies, with zigzags tracing lineage and circular motifs marking significant battles. A single topper cloth could unfold like an atlas, its borders charting migrations across Polynesia. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the Ashanti people wove proverbs into Kent cloth, gold and indigo stripes declaring wisdom like Nyansa ton wo yonko mu. Wisdom is like a baobab tree, no one person can embrace it. Unlike European embroidery, which often hid messages, Kent proclaimed them boldly, transforming wearers into walking manifestos. The contrasts between these traditions reveal as much as their similarities. Where medieval nuns tucked subversive prayers into altar cloths, Buddhist monks in Tibet created thangka tapestries to focus meditation. Their intricate mandalas designed to dissolve after use, teaching impermanence. In Scandinavia, Viking women wove runes into their aprons as protective spells, while in Mexico, Nahua artists embroidered cosmological maps onto garments, charting the 5 sacred directions with threads dyed in cochineal and indigo. Each culture's approach reflected its relationship with power. Some stitched in code to evade authority, others wove openly to proclaim identity. What unites them all is the understanding that fiber holds memory. A Navajo grandmother teaching her granddaughter to weave a storm pattern isn't just passing on a technique. She's preserving a worldview where rain clouds are summoned by the right twist of yarn. A Persian carpet's asymmetrical knots aren't flaws but deliberate modesty errors, acknowledging that only the divine can create perfection. Even the materials carried meaning: silk for nobility, flax for humility, camel hair for resilience. Today, as museums digitize these textiles, we risk flattening their depth. A quipu behind glass can't convey how it felt to run fingers along its knots like reading braille, nor can a photo capture the way a kimono's hidden stitches shimmer when the wearer moves. These were languages meant to be touched, worn, lived in, not just seen. Perhaps that's their greatest lesson. History isn't always written in books. Sometimes it's tied in a knot, buried in a seam, or coiled in the silent folds of a robe, waiting for hands patient enough to listen. Running your fingers along the edge of a centuries-old baby's cap, you might feel the slight unevenness of stitches where a mother's hands trembled, perhaps from cold, perhaps from grief. That irregularity isn't a flaw, it's a pulse. These textiles don't just tell stories, they preserve the very tremor of human emotion, a tactile bridge to moments when joy, sorrow, or defiance pressed needle to fabric. Consider the Huguenot woman who stitched a psalm into her child's swaddling band while hiding in a cellar, her tiny, frantic stitches mirroring her heartbeat. Or the Icelandic widow who wove her husband's fishing nets into a shawl, each knot a tally of days since the storm took him. These aren't artifacts, they're frozen fragments of lived experience. The intimacy of cloth amplifies this connection in ways parchment never could. A love letter yellowing in an archive feels distant compared to the visceral immediacy of an embroidered glove lining, its silk threads darkened by centuries of skin contact. Historians handling Elizabethan smocks note how sweat and perfume altered the fabric's chemistry, chemical signatures of fear before a trial, or anticipation before a wedding. That faint lavender scent lingering in a 400-year-old bodice, it wasn't just perfume, it was practical magic believed to calm the heart. Every thread absorbed the wearer's world, from wood smoke to candle wax to tears. What's most arresting is how these textiles collapse time, unfolding a medieval childbirth apron stained with herbal remedies. You're suddenly shoulder to shoulder with a midwife whispering spells over the same fabric. Tracing the repaired knee of a Civil War soldier's trousers, you feel the echo of his march. Unlike formal portraits or official documents, these objects preserve unguarded moments: the ink smudge on a scribe's sleeve, the toddler's sticky fingerprints on a nursemaid's apron. They capture life as it was lived, not as it was curated. The emotional power lies in their fragility. A samurai's torn battle standard, hastily mended with whatever thread was at hand, speaks louder than any victory scroll about the desperation of war. A quilt made from a mother's wedding dress and funeral shroud, its patches frayed from generations of use, holds more raw truth than any genealogy chart. These objects were never meant for museums. They were meant to be held, worn, wept into. That they survived at all feels like defiance, a whisper through time insisting we were here. Perhaps the most poignant examples are the ones that blur the line between art and artifact. The Bayeux Tapestry's chaotic borders, crammed with animals and laborers, remind us that history isn't just about the crowned figures at center stage. A Ghanaian mourning cloth, its indigo patterns fading where mourners clutched it tightest, maps grief in tidal lines of dye. Even something as simple as a Victorian handkerchief, monogrammed with invisible ink that only appears when dampened by tears, becomes a mirror to universal emotions. To engage with these textiles is to perform a kind of quiet seance. You're not just observing history, you're occupying the same physical space as those who came before. Their fingers where yours now trace the stitches, their breath once warming the fabric you hold. It's an intimacy no document can replicate, a conversation across centuries conducted in the language of thread. And like all great conversations, the most powerful parts aren't the words spoken aloud, but the pauses between them, the spaces where imagination meets evidence and the past reaches back. Future discoveries in textile archaeology won't just add footnotes to history, they'll rewrite entire chapters. Picture this: a team in a lab carbon dating a scrap of linen from a Viking burial, only to realize its weave pattern matches textiles found in North America, suggesting transatlantic contact centuries before Columbus. Or imagine infrared scans revealing a lost dialect embroidered into the hem of a medieval nun's habit, preserving a language thought to have vanished without a trace. Every crumpled glove, every stained tapestry fragment in a museum basement could be a time capsule waiting for the right technology to crack it open. The tools making this possible sound like science fiction. Hyperspectral imaging can now detect vanished dyes and underdrawings, while DNA analysis of textile fibers traces wool back to specific flocks, revealing ancient trade routes invisible to the naked eye. In Switzerland, researchers recently used synchrotron radiation to scan a Bronze Age belt without unspooling its corroded metal threads, revealing a celestial map woven into its design. These aren't incremental advances, they're seismic shifts in how we understand the past. A child's sock from Roman Egypt, dismissed for decades as mundane, might contain skin cells holding genetic stories of migration, disease resistance, or even familial bonds across centuries. What's thrilling is how these discoveries democratize history. For too long, the narrative belonged to those who could write: kings, clerics, merchants. But textiles whisper the stories of those excluded from the record. The enslaved woman who knotted her genealogy into a quilt's border, the samurai's wife encoding battle strategies in her husband's silk underrobe, the indigenous weaver recording an eclipse in the shifting patterns of a basket. As conservation techniques improve, we're not just recovering artifacts, we're restoring voices. The ethical implications are as complex as the stitching. Should we decode a mourning veil stitched with private grief? Does exposing a resistance fighter's hidden map dishonor their caution? Museums now collaborate with descendant communities to navigate these questions, sometimes choosing to leave certain threads unexamined, respecting the original intent of the maker. The future of textile archaeology isn't just about what we can uncover, but what we ought to. Perhaps most tantalizing are the mysteries we haven't yet imagined. A cloak buried in permafrost might preserve pollen, revealing a lost ecosystem. A nun's embroidery could contain encrypted equations predating Newton. Every textile is a palimpsest not just of the hands that made it, but of the earth it grew from, the hands that wore it, the histories it witnessed. The loom of the past is vast, and we've only just begun to trace its threads. The next time your fingers brush against an antique quilt or your eyes catch the intricate embroidery on a vintage jacket, pause for a moment. You might be holding someone's unread diary. That floral motif, it could map a migration route. That seemingly random scatter of stitches, a coded protest against injustice. These fabrics are more than relics, they're conversations across centuries, waiting for someone to lean in and listen. What makes these textiles so extraordinary is how ordinary they seem to their contemporaries. A merchant's wife in 16th century Flanders might have absent-mindedly traced the initials she'd hidden in her sleeve's embroidery while waiting for her husband's ship to return. A nun in a Spanish convent could have stitched her forbidden translation of scripture into an altar cloth, knowing the risk yet to her. It was simply another day's work. Their genius lay in making the extraordinary blend seamlessly into the mundane, turning everyday objects into vessels for stories too dangerous or delicate for ink. This legacy challenges us to rethink what counts as history. We're taught to value parchment decrees and printed treaties, but what about the servant's apron stitched with the dates of a royal coup? her needle documenting events no official chronicle would mention. Or the indigenous child's cradleboard, its beadwork encoding origin stories that predate written language. These textiles insist that history isn't just what's recorded, it's what's worn, mended, and passed hand to hand under the radar of power. Your own life might already intersect with this tradition. That scarf your grandmother knit with a slightly uneven edge, she might have been counting stitches to mark the days until your birth. The vintage handkerchief you found at a flea market, its monogram nearly invisible. Those faded threads could have once carried a love letter folded into its seams. We're surrounded by these quiet testaments. We've just forgotten how to read them. So here's your invitation. Become a decoder. Examine the heirloom tablecloth in your attic for symbols tucked between the flowers. Run your thumb along the seams of an old military uniform, feeling for knots that might have marked battles. Share what you find in the comments. Maybe together we'll piece together stories even museums have overlooked. And if you're hungry for more of these untold histories, hit subscribe. Who knows, the next hidden message we uncover could be in your family's trunk, just waiting for the right light to reveal its secret.